4 murders from Abilene. And Inspector Abilene said there were 4 murders in America by Jack the Ripper. And I researched the files for 6 months before and after. And darned if he wasn't correct. There were 4. 2 in New York, 2 in New Jersey.
Wow, this is an amazing case, and just keeps getting more amazing how a serial killer all of a sudden goes to another country and picks up where he left off.
He is probably a very rare case of an international serial killer who's changing his styles, changing his murder technique. He certainly was one of the things that they look at this person and saying, well, he's a borough poisoner. Why would a poisoner of women originally been using a knife? Well, when you take a look at Kozlowski, he's a trained surgeon. He knows poison. But when he left his position in Warsaw, Poland, he left his country, he left his language, he left his family, he left his job, he left everything, and became a hairdresser in the East End of London, one of the worst ghettos in Europe. He doesn't mind changing things at all.
He's a man who adapts.
He adapts very quickly to space and time and technique. Now, I wouldn't put anything past him, not at all.
Well, I understand that after his stay in America, Kozlowski returned to England. First, could you tell us a little bit more about his medical background?
Yes, there has been a good deal of debate about Kozlowski's surgical skills, understandably. It is important to understand that Kozlowski was fully qualified as a junior surgeon, and you'll have more than one author attempting to downgrade his abilities in this area. Because to be perfectly honest with you, if you've got a suspect who's a painter or has some other occupation with no surgical skills whatever, and you think you've got the guy, and you don't think it's Severino Kozlowski, then one of your jobs is to discount Kozlowski's surgical skills. And that's understandable.
True.
And that's been in discussion for a long time. But we have to remember, after 4.5 years as an apprentice surgeon, his primary surgical training was complete in Poland. Now, we have 2 critical documents. The first one is June 1st, 1885. Now, the only thing we got to recall is not the fact that he's a qualified junior surgeon, but the fact that he was at least qualified to cut out a body part. And the way you trained at that point, and probably now, is to cut up cadavers. So he knew the position of the body parts. And here's the first certificate. June 1st, 1885, quote, certificate issued to surgical apprentice Severin Antonio Kozlowski to the effect that Severin Kozlowski, was in my surgery for the purpose of studying surgery from December 1st, 1880 till June 1st, 1885. And during the whole of the time he, Severin Kozlowski, discharged accurately all his duties, he was diligent, of exemplary contact, and studied with zeal the science of surgery. And it's written by Mosky Rappaport, senior surgeon. Now, we have a second document published a year and a half later, after a good deal more training. This is in Warsaw now, Warsaw, Poland. It was issued on December the 5th, 1886. Now, once again, this is a critical document because it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was fully qualified in surgery. This was his final surgical certification. Now, it's dated December 5th, 1886. Quote, Ministry of the Interior, Medical Administration of Warsaw, December 5, 1886. In consequence of the application presented by Severin Kozlowski, surgical pupil, the Medical Administration hereby testify to the effect that they do not see any reason to oppose his receiving the degree of junior surgeon. The required stamp duties have been paid. So once again, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he was fully qualified in surgery, not to mention his ability in poisons.
Wow, it's very,
And they're still debating that.
Still debating that?
They're still debating that. And you'll see books right now that say, well, he didn't know how to use a knife. And that's just plain silly.
I remember when we spoke in the interview before, I asked about the actual occupation of surgeons back in those times. Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, did you say they were closer to a barber than they actually were a doctor, surgeons?
Well, the original occupation was barber surgeon.
Okay.
Where they would do bleedings and work with leeches, et cetera, and all kinds of things like that. But again, the Warsaw hospital he went to was the military Warsaw Hospital, one of the finest training hospitals in continental Europe at the time.
Okay.
So you had surgeons back in 1828 in Edinburgh, Scotland. That was a major training area for surgeons. We're talking 60 years later.
Also, like worldwide, like surgeons from all over the world would go there.
We had one of George Washington's personal doctors was a surgeon trained in Edinburgh, Scotland.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so that was a good training center. For continental Europe, Warsaw Hospital, a medical center for training surgeons, that was primary education. This was not a guy who was just bleeding people. This guy was an actual junior surgeon, and he left very quickly.
Okay, wow. Okay, in your book, The Poison Murders of Jack the Ripper, you detail 3 murders committed by Pavowski after he returned to England. What was he doing in the meantime?
Well, after visiting his wife Lucy and his new child, the girl's name was Cecilia. She was born in 1892 in England. We actually lose track of him from July 1892 until November 1893. What he was doing, or who he may have killed, or even where he was at, has been lost for nearly a year and a half. And that's really not a really good thing to be losing tracking of a serial killer.
Oh, exactly.
But we lose him. There's just no evidence, no witnesses, no testimony of where he was. Now, getting back to his daughter, Cecilia Pavowski, again born in 1892, she died in 1960. So she was around for a while. She would marry and have 6 children. Now, these are the grandchildren of Jack the Ripper. And the last 2 grandchildren of Jack the Ripper from Cecilia died in 2006 and 2007. That's pretty recent.
Very recent, yes.
Very recent. Now, with 6 children, they probably had children. So I don't know exactly how many are, but there's got to be some great-grandchildren out there today from Jack the Ripper. Now, when we finally have him surfacing, Pavowski in November 1893, he's surfacing in South Tottenham, England. He's working as a barber again. Now, he met a woman named Annie Georgina Chapman. Now, he seemed to have pretty good skills with getting ladies to move in with him because she moves in with him and lives as his Mr. and Mrs. Pavowski from December 1893 to December 1894. He seemed to be a pretty good ladies' man because he keeps getting women moving in with him. Now, here's the problem. Pavowski's real wife drops by, and Pavowski wants both of them to live with him. So he's got his real wife, Lucy Baggerski, who was sort of the real wife because you forget about the woman from Poland. But Annie doesn't go with this. She's pregnant. She moves out. Eventually, his wife, Lucy, leaves him. But it's an interesting case because Annie Georgina Chapman is the daughter of Ripper victim Annie Chapman, who he murdered in 1888.
Wow.
So the child, and they have a child, she was pregnant, is the granddaughter of a Ripper victim and the daughter of Jack the Ripper. Now, what's even more incredible is by early 1895, this is after she leaves, he had become American George Chapman. He changes his name. He's again continuing to hide. Now, he becomes George Chapman, having cut out, if you'll pardon the expression, cut out the female portions of Annie's name, Annie Georgina Chapman. He becomes George Chapman. And George Chapman is looking for a wife. Now, this gives history 2 lineages of Ripper children. The Chapman one and the Pavowski one. So we've got a couple of lines going on right there.
So, is any of the has any of his offspring or children shown any kind of recessive traits of maybe going into the father's line of work?
That's an interesting question. I haven't researched that. I don't know if anybody has, but you would have to think first of all that Pavowski is Jack the Ripper, and I do believe he is Jack the Ripper. And if they have, that sounds like somebody might want to get out there and do a little research and maybe write a book. But I don't have any information on that. It's possible if being a serial killer is transmitted through your genes.
You know, the one thing I'm starting to see about Pavowski is also he seems like a narcissist, and I think narcissism is sort of exhibited in a lot of his murders because it's almost like he wants them to be signature, and that's so he wants people to know it's him. So I mean that's a telltale sign of a narcissism, and then. Is the way that he sort of reacts with the women. It seems like he's a narcissist. So
it's part of his psyche, sure. Yeah.
So even
part of his makeup.
So you can even tie that in nowadays. If you look at psychological makeup, the narcissistic sort of characteristics in him would almost sort of make him a person of interest.
You'd think, yeah. If you had an analysis these days, you might be able to pick him up a little sooner than they could back then. But like I said, back then they really didn't have too much of a way to get this guy.
So, Michael, who was his first poison murder victim?
Well, as you said, he's now George Chapman, and this is during the spring of 1895, and he met a woman called Mary Isabella Spink. She's married. 41 years old, and he's still working as a barber. Now, again, he seems to have an attraction to women because on October 27th, 1895, just a little ways after he meets her, they have a fake marriage. Now, Mrs. Spink is a willing participant. She knows she's still married to her husband, Mr. Spink, and she becomes the fake Mrs. Chapman. Now we have Mrs. Chapman, a fake marriage to a man with a fake identity. And he's still married, of course, to Lucy Pavowski, i.e. Mrs. Kozlowski. Now, Mrs. Spink has some money here, which is probably what attracted him to her. And he has enough money to set him up in his own barbershop business. So now he has his first business other than the one on 123 Cable Street, which eventually failed. So he's got his new barbershop going. Now, at this point, we have a situation when it comes to the poison. 18 months later, after he's with Mrs. Spink, he's busy taking money out of her account. A little bit here, a little bit there, a few $100. Ends up being quite a bit of money. But he purchases poison on April the 3rd, 1897. He bought some antimony with a big, deep red label. Now, again, remember, he tried to buy poison in 1888, but he failed. Now he's successful. He purchases from a chemist named William Davison in Hastings. Now, he would be called upon to testify at his trial later on, so we know who this person was. Kozlowski signed the poison register G. Chapman, because, of course, he's playing like he's American George Chapman. So that's his new identity. Now, after he emptied her bank account, his new wife becomes ill. Not an unfamiliar territory there. 8 months after the purchase, on December the 25th, 1897, Mrs. Spink dies of antimony poisoning. The doctors, not a very good doctor, pronounced it to be a natural death, not poison. So he'd gotten away with another murder.
Okay, after getting away with poisoning one woman, he moved on to a second one, right?
That's correct. It's March 1898, and he now has a new business. He's moved his business, and he's now a pub owner. He's the publisher of Prince of Wales Pub. And, of course, he used Spink's money to pick up the pub right there. Of course. And he's looking for a barmaid, as he is wanting to do. And along comes Elizabeth Bessie Taylor. She's 36 years old. She arrives. And once again, she soon becomes Mrs. Chapman. And again, another fake marriage. Again, he's already married. They moved to another pub, the Grapes, in Bishop Stanford. You can't have too many bodies dropping in your pubs here. Again, you got to kind of move on a little bit here.
Bad for business, I would say.
Bad for business. So in August 1898, he moves with Taylor to the Monument Pub in Southwick. Now, that's south of the river. It's south of the Thames. He moved around a lot, looking over his shoulder constantly. So he's changing his name, his occupation, his location, his workplace, his country, even his language. February 13, 1901, Elizabeth Taylor is killed by a final dose of antimony poisoning. Now that's at the Monument Pub. Once again, the death was ruled as natural. There's no investigation. Now here's where he made a mistake. And it's a biggie.
Okay.
One of his many. He could have easily had these two women cremated. No evidence of antimony poisoning if you don't have a body.
Exactly.
He didn't do that. He had them buried, and that'll come back to haunt him. Now, there's an observation at this point. There's one final torso murder, which is June 8th, 1902, just after they moved to the pub. It's called the Salamanca Place murder. Now, what's interesting about this is, again, Kozlowski's back in town. He's moved south of the river, and Salamanca Place is an alley near the river about a mile southwest of the Crown Public House. The pile of body parts is found by workmen in an alley about 5 in the morning. Now here's the report. The head was laying partly on its side. In addition to the head, I saw what appeared to be legs and arms all piled together, the head being on top. It looked as though the remains had been placed there carefully, and not as if they had been shot out of a sack. In other words, just dumped. Mm-hmm. The body was really in 3 pieces. First came the legs, then the lower part of the body, and the head was in the pelvis. Close quote. Now, when they later examined it, the body parts that were missing and the head had been boiled with teeth removed and hair removed. So he's getting rid of the identification. They figured out that the woman was 25, 30 years old, unidentified. Again, another torso murder. Coroner's verdict was by person or persons unknown. So at least they realized this was a murder. Mm-hmm. The doctors concluded that this torso murder had been committed by the same individual as the 4 earlier torso murders. So what you have is all 5 torso murders committed by one individual matching the time and place by Severin Kozlowski every single place. While he's moving to London, while he's in London during the Ripper murders, he leaves to America, comes back, goes south of the river, another body drops, torso murder. And it's interesting that after he was finally arrested, the torso murders ended too. Now, the fact that the torso murders are all by the same individual, they were never able to try anybody or convict anybody for torso murder.
So he committed one last murder by poison.
Yes. That was October 1901. Again, a strange case. Maude Marsh. She's the final barmaid at the monument. Now, we had a murder at the monument, but now they had to move away from the monument. Again, you can't have too many dropping bodies at the same place. And on October the 25th, 1901, there was an arson at the monument. Now, Maude Marsh had only been there for a while. And all of a sudden, she's now Mrs. Chapman. It was obviously arson. But even with that, he moves into the Crown Public House with Maude Marsh. And it's the last public house he's going to run. But now, why they let a guy who they think was busy trying to burn down one pub got to another, can't tell you. Just a little strange. But the pub was his final business and home. It was 213 Burrell High Street in Southwick, south of the river. And he almost immediately begins to slowly poison Maude. She dies October 22nd, 1902. Now, what's interesting is that the finally is reported as a murder has been committed, and there's only one suspect. So the doctors on this one finally were able to state it's not a natural death, it's murder by poison. 2 days later, October 25th, 1902, George Chapman, American, if you will, is arrested for one murder, poison murder.
Well, after his last murder, was there a trial? How did it go after that?
Oh, that's correct. But before we get to that, the police had a police court hearing. They declared Kozlowski as the killer in the police investigation. Coroner's jury agreed. They declared that Kozlowski was the killer. So now you have a trial. It was a 4-day trial from March 16 to 19th, 1903. They had really no real defense was put up. There's no suspects, people who, for him that would say, well, he didn't do this, didn't do that, didn't have skills. The critical part of the trial were the witnesses whose testimony placed Kozlowski in the right places, the right times to be Jack the Ripper. It's interesting because you won't find the Ripper in the Ripper files. Okay. He's not there. But you will find him in the transcripts of the Burrell Poisoner trial of George Chapman, because they did the antecedents of this killer. That's one of the earlier cases where the suspect's antecedents were introduced as part of the case for the murder trial. So when they interviewed the people, they could say, okay, this guy's moving around where Jack the Ripper was. He's got the skills too. The March 19 jury returned after 10 minutes with a verdict. Wow. 10 minutes. They barely had time to get their tea. And the verdict was, quote, we find the prisoner guilty. Now, it didn't take long for Judge Grantham to immediately address Kozlowski and had some very interesting things to say here. Okay. He, at this point, probably knows that this guy is Jack the Ripper because it's been all through the papers. Because the testimony was put in the papers. I mean, people are really interested in what's going on here. He said, quote, he didn't, by the way, use George Chapman name. Here's what the judge said. Quote, Severino Kozlowski, I have but one duty to perform, and it is not necessary for me to say more. It is the duty of sentencing you to death. The only satisfactory feature of this case, just completed, is that I have been able to address you as a foreigner and not as an Englishman.
Wow, so he was executed.
Well, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. April 7th, 1903. They didn't take any time. Remember, the trial was March 16th through 19th. This is 3 weeks later. Okay. They didn't waste any time. No. On killers. Catholic priest took his confidential confession. Now, can you imagine being a fly on the wall listening to that confession by Jack the Ripper, and how much he could have told that Catholic priest? Wow, just a minute, because I was raised Catholic. And I know what it's like to be inside a confessional. So yeah, you kind of tell the priest everything. That's the only way you can get absolution completely. So, but he couldn't have told anybody. Priest had to keep it to himself. Yeah, exactly. So what a thing to know and be the only one basically on the planet who knows who Jack the Ripper was and couldn't say a word. And to go to your grave. Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. 7 a.m., simple meal of bread, butter, and coffee. That's about as simple as it can get.
That's it.
Although I must appreciate the coffee. It'd be interesting to know what kind of coffee he was having, actually. 3 men were hanged in 1903 in Wadsworth Prison. Kozlowski would be number 2. And William Billington, of the Billington family, they had lots of executioners in that family. He had the execution honors. And we have an eyewitness report of the hanging, which I personally think is basically the way you would hope that all serial killers meet their end.
Okay.
And it's quite detailed here. It's kind of interesting. Quote, this is from a witness of his execution. All the color had drained from the killer's face as 2 guards pulled him out of the cell and escorted him for his final death walk. He was ashen pale and almost stumbled more than once, and the dread of his rapidly approaching end seemed too great a strain on his nerves. So he was out in the open, in the wet and cold yard, and once again stumbled when he saw the execution shed not 50 yards across the open area of the prison. He continues. As he walked the final yards, Kozlowski, still half supported and pulled to the shed by the guards, made frequent ejaculations and muttered inaudibly. He was half carried into the hanging shed. As he was at the steps of the scaffold again, he muttered to those in attendance and cursed those who would take his miserable life. He trembled uncontrollably and looked white as a sheet and sweated profusely. Kozlowski seemed to raise his body as the shock of having his rope placed around his neck struck home. The rope and his executioner would be the last he would see of his life. The prisoner was now only seconds away from death. Mumbling could be heard. Billington gave a fast look at the officials, and Major Knox, the sheriff, gave a nod to the executioner as Billington pulled the lever on 36-year-old Severino Antoniovich Kozlowski. The trap door fell open with a small banging sound and a drop of 6 foot 6 inches. Given snapped the neck of the serial killer as his hooded head jerked backwards, for all intent and purpose, ending the life instantaneously with an audible snap. So, at this point, Jack the Ripper, in the guise of Severino Kozlowski, alias George Chapman, was dead.
Wow. What a way to go.
What a way to go. Absolutely terrified. And I am delighted to be able to state that that's the way a serial killer should be killed.
That's how most of them go, I believe. They sit out here and they victimize
Sure.
the weak or the people who
absolutely
who lower their defenses. And then when it's their time to go, they're shivering cowards.
Yep. Well, he kept picking on people who were weaker, poisoned, or drunk, ill, etc. So he died very appropriate, I think, as an absolute coward and terrified.
Well, looking to the future, do you think it's actually possible to solve this case?
Actually, I do. There are several areas to investigate, and this is a little word here to the Scotland Yard inspectors who may be listening at the point. You can begin with the Pinchin Street torso. We talked about that, 1889. DNA to match his first wife would be the way to deal with that. You could dig in and around 123 Cable Street. St. George's in the east. We're still missing the head. And we know he had to put it somewhere. They didn't float in the Thames.
Exactly.
Kozlowski's black medical bag, which was found at the Crown Public House. It's probably at the Black Museum, which is the Museum of Crime, headquarters of Scotland Yard. Blood and DNA under the handle. If it's matched to the DNA of relatives of the Ripper victims, you've got Jack the Ripper right there. You can also search the backyard and basement walls of 213 Borough High Street, the Crown Public House. It's been renovated, but the basement is still there. Backyard is still there. I would also suggest a review of police officers' notebooks from the time period. If you can find his name on the suspects list in their book, that might be a way to put him specifically at a second position, because we know he was living in the Martha Tabrins building. You can match Kozlowski's known handwriting to the letter from hell. We talked about the letter. We know that with the kidney that was sent, that was his handwriting. So they did get his diary. That's on the list of things that were taken as property from 213 Borough High Street, the Crown Public House. So we have his writing. Match it to the letter from hell. We don't have the letter, but we've got a photograph of it. It's close enough. We could locate his mother's death certificate in Poland. And how did she die and when? If she died around March 1887 with a slit throat, well, we can pretty much guess who did that. So that might be a way to help. And you could also match his DNA from relatives of Annie Georgina Chapman, the Ripper victim, Annie Chapman, to confirm that was what she was.
Hey, well, how close do you feel Scotland Yard is to finally solving this case, or at least focusing on the so-called person of interest?
To be honest with you, Jude, I think Scotland Yard is well aware of who Jack the Ripper was and may well have enough evidence to at least officially announce the name of a person of interest. And when they do, I have little doubt it will be Severino Kozlowski, better known as the Brill Poisoner.
Okay, we focused on the Ripper and related murder cases. But do you have any other books on true crime you've written?
Oh, yeah, we spoke him a little earlier. The first one was the infamous Burke and Hare. This is about a pair of body snatchers, grave robbers, and serial killers out of 1828 Edinburgh, Scotland. Then I have Murder Files from Scotland Yard and the Black Museum, which is a series of murder cases taken from Scotland Yard's case files, and that's from the 19th and 20th century. And then I have one that hasn't been published yet called Before He Was Jack.
Okay.
And it's a psychological look at the Ripper's early years.
Interesting.
We compare his activities to known serial killers and review the murders he is suspected of committing. So if there's an interesting publisher out there, let me know. Be happy to send you a copy.
That's definitely interesting topics. Very interesting. I can't see an editor or publisher who wouldn't be interested in that. Yeah, so.
Well, hopefully it'll be the first psychological analysis of Jack the Ripper, at least from point of view of Severin Kozlowski.
Well, I think that's really what's in right now. As far as what people want to do is they want to delve into the psychology rather than the actual acts. They want to delve into the mind, and I guess that might be because of like Dexter and some other shows have come out.
Sure.
So I think that's you're right on. I think you're sort of right on the pulse of what the listeners and readers of crime and murder novels want to hear. They want to hear the psychology nowadays.
Well, if they can understand the psychology, they might be able to find it a little earlier than they do. And maybe save some people's lives. That's why they interview serial killers so often.
And the kind of connection we have to them. You know, what makes us different than Jack the Ripper or, the Son of Sam or,
Then they're usually ending up being the guy next door.
Exactly. So it might actually be a help. Exactly. You're right. It could be that you could save your life.
You might.
Okay, well, for our listeners, Michael, everybody out there, Michael's books are available on Amazon.com or through your local bookstores. I also understand you have designed a board game based on your research into the Ripper murders. Wow, very interesting. I like that.
That was fun to do. That's fun to do. Yeah, it's called The Hunt for Jack the Ripper, and it's where players take on the identities of Scotland Yard detectives, and by a timeline, they follow the clues to uncover and capture the killer before he runs out of time and escapes. And we've done a few tests on it, and we've done maybe 6 or 7 tests. Half the time he escapes, and half the time you find him. So if you're looking for a board game publisher out there, let me know.
That's also very interesting. I mean, crime is just in right now. So I think you really got your market niche demographic right there, Michael. I really do. Well, this is Jude, and thanks for turning into interview with true crime author R.Michael Gordon on the subject of Victorian London's infamous 19th century serial killer Jack the Ripper. Michael, thank you very much. And man, it's been very enlightening in a very morbid way, but a very fun way. And I appreciate you stopping by to the Wash for Rippercast. And
well, thank you, Jude. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure at the coffee shop interview.
Okay, cool. Okay, and listen, we're gonna have a follow up to this, so make sure you stay close. So to everybody out there, this has been the Wash Rippercast, and we are out. Bye bye. Good job, sir. 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 Good job, sir.